Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Mob Archaeologist. I'm here with Rick and Eric. Unfortunately, Tony can't make it. And tonight we have a very special guest. He's a researcher on the Bonanno family in the 20th century, primarily the Bonanno War of 1964. And we're lucky here to have him with us. I'd like to introduce and give a warm welcome to Griffin.
Oh, thank you. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you, Griffin.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say too, some of the best researchers are people that the public would never otherwise hear of because they're busy researching, talking to other researchers, and Griffin's a great example of that. I've learned an immense amount of information about the Bonanno family. I thought I knew stuff. He goes
Absolutely.
even deeper.
Yeah, and I've learned so much from you, you guys and Tony and so many others we've all kind of known and got to talk to. So I'm very honored to hear that and share what I've spent the last couple of years just really focusing on.
Well, what got you into it? What was your start as far as getting into the Bonanno family, mafia as a whole?
Like a lot of people, or a lot of people who kind of get into the subject, it's a lot of watching the movies, Goodfellas, The Godfather. And then at some point, kind of in late high school, I started reading more about the actual mafia. And there's a lot of like this Five Families by Selwyn Rabb. He talks about the Bonanno War. And I grew up in Arizona for the first couple years of my life. So I kind of heard, or I just had knew that there was a mobster named Joe Bonanno who lived in Arizona for a time. So I kind of got interested in them and read his book and then Bill Bonanno's book. And in the book, Joe Bonanno talks about it briefly, but Bill Bonanno goes into the Bonanno War a little bit more in depth. But because they were active participants, obviously they have a lot to say, but they're also very biased. So part of me was interested in getting more of the full story of what had happened as it was being reported. And then just before we were talking about, or I was mentioning, I was reading up on the Sam DeCavalcante tapes, the wiretaps in the 60s. And that, like, they really go into what the kind of central kind of cause for the war. And it's not necessarily like taking over rackets or taking territory. It's more about who's going to be the representative of this family. And when you see them talking about it, they take it really seriously. So I thought that was very interesting. And then also that's kind of more political debate about the role of the commission and how it can insert itself into an individual family. Because that's kind of a central tension that Bonanno talks about of like, well, this is my family. This is my Borgata. You can't tell me how to run my family. And they're saying, well, if there's internal issues, then that's when we will step in.
Bonanno, I'm a father.
Yeah,
I'm a
exactly.
father
Like this. Yeah, and that's, I think as we talked about, like Sam DeCavalcante says that on the tapes that they call him our father. So when he says that in the book,
Sam seems confused by it. He's like, it's the weirdest thing. Like all the guys call him the father, their father.
yeah, which I think does appear in other families. I think in Underboss, Sam Gravano uses it, but yeah, it can definitely be kind of a weird thing to hear if you're unfamiliar with that, but it's true.
Based upon what you've learned, how do you think the war started?
I think overall the story is pretty consistent where Bonanno kind of more gets further alienated from the commission as these kind of internal moves happen in the late 50s. So as Frank Costello gets out, or Albert Anastasia is murdered, he's kind of starts to get, I think he described like outmaneuvered by what he terms the liberal faction of the commission. That plus the Appalachian kind of fiasco and increased law enforcement and newspaper attention, he kind of further alienates himself from the New York scene, which causes further tension on the commission. As Magadino talks about that when the Gallo War is ramping up in the Colombo or Profaci family, he's trying to get Bonanno to come in and actually help out like with arbitrating this dispute. So I think that definitely played a role in it and that kind of alienated himself from the other members. And then Bonanno's consigliere, John Tartamella, eventually kind of due to health reasons having to step down. and Bill Bonanno getting put in there didn't help. And then, yeah, so the kind of central tension, or the real kind of big one, is it seems to be Gaspar di Gregorio being shelved. So Gaspar di Gregorio, for those who may not be super familiar, was an old-time member. He's Castellamare, just like Joe Bonanno and a lot of other members of the family. He was married to Stefano Magaddino's Bonanno cousin's sister, so he's a brother-in-law. He gets shelved, and that's one thing where I kind of have been able to untangle is how exactly that happened. There's some meeting where Di Gregorio was called in to kind of just have a meeting of the family, and for some reason he didn't show up. It's not clear whether he was under the protection of the commission at that time or it was after he got shelved, but eventually it gets understood that Gaspar di Gregorio he's under the protection of the commission for fear of his life. Whether he got shelved before then or after, eventually he got shelved from the family. I think people know generally, well, if you kind of read on the subject, you'll know about the Bonanno War. You can kind of cover that pretty quickly, but there's a lot more that, once you kind of dig into, you find. But
there's a series of infractions, like he
Yeah.
committed some major infractions. I know they discussed them on the DeCavalcante tape. One of the first big ones was his alleged attempt to take over the LA family. And I know, we hear the story that Joe Bonanno's sending Bill, who was a captain in Arizona, and at that time a captain in Arizona, and he's sending Bill with what I call his 40 thieves. There's allegedly these members who are going to take over LA. But there's a little more to it, because I believe it was Frank Bompensero who said after Jack Dragna died in LA, their commission representation switched from the Lucchese's to Joe Bonanno, but he didn't get along with Frank Desimone, and Desimone was going around Bonanno and contacting other East Coast bosses instead of Bonanno. So it seems like Bonanno might have used that as a justification. These guys are slippery. Like they're Joe Bonanno is not just going to try to take over LA. He's going to find a justification, which is that Desimone's not doing what he's meant to do. But interestingly, that doesn't seem to, that was earlier. That's not 1964. So it's interesting that happened early, but was brought up later.
Yeah, and I think even on the DeCavalcante tapes, and then Tommy Ebele, or don't remember how to say it, but he talks about it as well on a wiretap. He got caught on that. The commission kind of forgave him for that, or they kind of said it. They like, okay, you tried, you didn't, we stopped you. Let's move on. It wasn't like a big, it wasn't a huge thing until, like you said, the series infractions got built up, and that was just one of the reasons why they wanted to eventually call him in. And obviously, well, he was also making members while the books were closed in Montreal, in Arizona, or the West Coast. Not sure if there was any New York guys who might have gotten made during that time. I know we've talked about online and over text about Patty DiFilippio, Patty from the Bronx. It seems like he might have gotten made during this time. He's kind of a big figure later on.
That's a big thing. The books closed in 1957. Valachi said members in rare cases could be sent out of town to be made and then sent back, but that's with the commission approval. And here Bonanno is, even though these members are in Montreal and the West Coast and Arizona, they still belong to the Bonanno family, and therefore the books are closed in New York. He can't make people. So that's a pretty big deal. I mean, that offsets the status quo.
Yeah, definitely. But, what kind of sets off the war is the shelving of Gaspar di Gregorio. Like I was saying earlier, is this old-time member that Sam DeCavalcante says he was a machine gun during, the wars of the 30s. So he's a pretty serious guy. He was probably a longtime captain in Brooklyn. He gets shelved for apparently getting called into a meeting and not showing up, which many other sources say once you get called in, you have to go. It's a very serious role that you get killed over. So he gets shelved. The commission kind of starts calling him in to meet with them about that infraction and many others. And he in turn refuses to come in. I think he's ducking them for over a year. And finally, when they kind of get him pinned, Sam DeCavalcante goes. And then another thing I find really interesting about this is he hinges his refusal on a technicality, which is 3 members go to him and say, okay, the commission's going to absolve you, like just come in and talk to us. And then 2 members go and tell him the same thing. He's like, well, it has to be 3 members to tell me this, to officially give notice. And that kind of just devolves it even further. And eventually in September of 1964, they stopped recognizing him as the boss. Both him, the consigliere, which was at this point Bill Bonanno, and the underboss, John Morales. And so that's the thing. It's like these kind of big infractions of trying to take over California, making members. We actually didn't even cover his alleged role in trying to kill Carlo Gambino and Thomas Lucchese with the interim boss of the Profaci family, Joe Magliocco. Now, I think that allegation kind of comes a little bit later. But it's him refusing to come in and saying that, well, you gave me a message that wasn't valid because it wasn't 3 members. It was 2 guys who. So it's just these very things that hinge on protocol and getting out of things based on it's not valid because it's 2 guys instead of 3.
You just mentioned the Profaci issue. I think we should hit on that for a second. Mm-hmm. Correct me if I have any of this wrong, but my understanding of it is the Gallo War is starting when Joe Profaci is still alive. He dies. His brother-in-law is the underboss, and just immediately he holds an election, according to Greg Scarpa, where they force him in as boss. The commission never recognizes him. Then this plot comes out that Magliocco's attempting to kill Gambino and Lucchese. Mm-hmm. I don't know if he thought they were involved with the Gallo War, supporting them or what, but then there's this alleged contract where Joe Magliocco goes to Joe Colombo to give him the order to kill them, but he has Bill Bonanno with him because he was living at his house at the time because he was married to Magliocco's niece. So that sort of starts this, I don't want to call it a conspiracy theory because, I mean, I do suspect Joe Bonanno might have been behind propping Magliocco up. He was trying to keep his ally in New York and on the commission. What's your take on that? Do you think Bonanno had his hand in that?
I agree. I definitely think it's possible. I feel like because Magaddino talks about them actually stripping Magliocco of the title. Well, essentially saying like, who are you? We never recognized you. Like you kind of forced your way into, well, he's saying he forced him in, but like you said, it seems like there was some kind of election. But I think Magaddino talked about how because the Gallo brothers weren't a part of that family, it wasn't like a real election because not everyone was, involved. But he's like, who are you? And then they call him on that. And I think he says like no one else was involved. Magaddino reports Magliocco saying that. So, but of course, if Bonanno was involved, who knows if Magliocco would actually say. But yeah, I think Bill living at the Magliocco house at the time, which was due to marital issues he was having with his wife, definitely didn't help that. But yeah, it's really, I think it is in line with Bonanno to try to, at least, if not tell him, hey, go kill these guys, kind of whisper in his ear, being like, hey, you should take them out. So I think the Gallos, or some of them, were under Gambino at that time. He was kind of harboring them.
Like De Gregorio getting protection, they got protection sort of thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I definitely think it's possible. I don't think it was ever proven or ever like a formal charge, but it was definitely something that was in the air of like he tried to, like the mafia is just a big game of telephone, eventually turned into, Bonanno and Magliocco were trying to take out Gambino and Lucchese.
One of my takeaways, at least a long time ago, maybe, the thinking has evolved, was that one of the reasons for the war was discontent over Joe Bonanno trying to elevate his son, Bill Bonanno, very quickly, which ruffled the feathers of more older senior members. Because Bill Bonanno spent his time out in Arizona running guns into Mexico. Yeah. And a few years later, he's a member. And then after that, he just rises, continues to hold higher offices. And I always heard that other members like De Gregorio had an issue with that. What's your take?
Definitely. I think that was definitely a feeling among the family. I think Joe Ziccarelli, who was on the Sam de Cavalcanti tapes very often talking to Sam about that, he says the same thing. Like when he was making Sigliere, I told him it's like you have 3 strikes against you, which is like you're born rich, you're the boss's son. And he said something else, but yeah, there was that feeling of he's trying to elevate Bill quickly over De Gregorio, many other older members. And Bill's book kind of makes it seem like he like he mentions that, but is like, well, I was very active. I was taking care of sit downs and such, which could be true. But I definitely think that was a real feeling in the family. And one thing too, I found just reading through FBI files, Joe Bonanno's brother-in-law, he had many brother-in-laws who were kind of both members and then tangentially involved. Frank Labrizio, the FBI wired his office. And through that, they've kind of found a lot more information, which isn't as well available as the DeCavalcante tapes, but just bits have kind of come out over the years in FBI files. But through that, it really comes clear that Bonanno was trying to clear the way for Bill to become boss. One of the things was Joe was actually going to step down before the Bonanno War kind of kicked off. He was going to elevate Labrizio to boss, Bill to consigliere, and John Morales, better known as Johnny Burns, he elevated him to official underboss. And Morales was himself a relative of Bonanno through marriage to one of his uncles or his uncle's daughters. And then eventually, because Labrizio wasn't going to be the long-term boss, it was just more of a placeholder until Bill gained more experience. That was kind of Bill or Joe's long-term plan, which definitely would have probably been clearer to Bonanno members of, well, he's clearly just going to pass the torch on to his son, even though he's ostensibly going to step down, he'll still be controlling the family through Bill.
Yeah, there's a
So in a way, it's similar to what the Persico have done with the Columbos. It's basically a takeover of the entire family, except they managed to get away with it.
Yeah. Bonannos didn't last nearly as long.
With the Bonannos, I mean, they came from that sort of clan element where that was the norm. But it seems like the bigger issue isn't that Bill was a relative. It's not the nepotism, because that was a big part of the mafia, the Sicilian mafia the Bonannos came from. But it seems to have been Bill. I mean, we know from those tapes, Bill was hated. Like Bill was, people were upset with Joe Bonanno, but they seem to have personally hated Bill. So he becomes the consigliere. How does that even happen? Like, how does a guy like Bill become this senior figure in the administration? Do you know anything about how he was actually appointed? Because we know that's often an elected role.
Yeah,
supposed to be.
Yeah, that's one of those things where I think I could see both. Yeah, because as we this has been kind of talked about more in recent years, the consigliere. Eric, you point this out a lot, that it's not the Tom Hagen that people kind of know. It's more of a organizational role that ties to a lot of like important things about the protocol of the organization. So Bill kind of becoming consigliere so early, so it being an elected position, I could see both ways of Bonanno kind of steering the election towards Bill, like it being as legitimate as a mafia election could be, or him just installing him as consigliere. I could kind of see both ways. Of course, in their books, they talk about it as if Bill was elected fair and square. But then in other sources, they just say, oh, Bill was installed as consigliere. There definitely could be a middle ground where both kind of happened, where Bill was ostensibly elected, but more in reality installed. So
yeah, it could have been that the capos felt pressured to elect them.
Because they just know it's like, well, this is what the boss wants, and even though they didn't like it and didn't probably think that it would lead to what it led, or one of the things that led to what it did, they just probably went along with it.
There's a wiretap from the late 50s of Sam Giancana and Tony Accardo where they're upset because, as they say, Joe Bonanno made his son the quote-unquote boss in Arizona. The late 50s probably coincides with Bill becoming a captain out there, I'm guessing. So when they say boss, they mean he was simply promoted. But you can see they were already feeling threatened by that. They see that as a maneuver to gain influence on the West Coast. And that seems to be before the attempted California takeover and everything. So it's interesting that Chicago, which had its own West Coast interests, were already disturbed by Joe and Bill Bonanno at that time too.
Yeah, the kind of reputation that he had, that again, even probably before that attempted takeover, that they, exactly right, they felt threatened. It doesn't surprise me that people were kind of, especially with him being absent, it's probably more like, well, what is he doing? What is he planning? I mean, Magaddino was very paranoid about him being involved in Montreal.
And with the California thing, I want to add, before we move on to the actual war, One of the LA informants, might have been Bompensero, said that how he tried to remove Desimone was he had a West Coast Bonanno member, mysterious guy, I think like Bello is his name. I don't know who he
Yeah.
is, but
I don't think there's any hard art like records of a guy with that name living there. I mean, I know just aside, the mafia membership log, like I think he tried there's no records kind of that matching that description. So we really have no idea who that is.
yeah, and he said whoever this guy Bello was, he had him contact Bompensero, had a meeting. I think it was like Jimmy Fradiano, Frank Bompensero, and then this guy Biagio Bonventri, who is not related to he's like the only Bonventri not related to the Bonannos, but he had a meeting with them where he said Frank Desimone is planning to kill Frank Bompensero with a car bomb. And Frank was like, my daughter drives that car. So they went up to LA, they kidnap a captain of the LA family and who's close to Desimone. He says that there was no plot. Bello eventually confesses that Bonanno put him up to it. So it seems like Bonanno made up a lie so that Bompensero and he was close to Bompensero up until his death. They made contact and stuff. So he puts this lie into place that to get them to kill their own boss. So that tells us about what this plot actually involved. Like it wasn't just Bill Bonanno storming Los Angeles like D-Day. It was going to be this much more nefarious, which fits Joe Bonanno, right? You know, he very expert schemer.
Mm-hmm. You know, I for some reason in my mind, I've never really because the California plot is one of the more mysterious parts of this. But yeah, I always kind of thought that those were maybe two separate incidences. But you're right that it's still because I think the whole thing with Bill and the 40 Men was that they were going to kind of move into positions of power within how that would have actually worked. But they would have just essentially, as you said, taken over. But for some reason, I always thought there was two separate instances. But you're right; it could be that was probably the initial taking out of the boss, and then Bill would move in and kind of take over everything.
Makes sense.
One of the interesting things about this, and I don't think a lot of people know it, I believe, Griffin, you found this out, but Bill Bonanno was a secret informant with the FBI during the war.
Yeah.
Before we go into the war itself, this is something not a lot of people know.
Well, yeah, it was Ed Valin who wrote that article on, he calls it Rat Traps, which are really incredible articles. But yeah, Bill Bonanno after, we could probably put a link to the actual article, but he and a couple other people found, well, he broke it down from files on Mary Farrell, but then there was this this interview that came out in some FBI file of Bill being interviewed after the kidnapping, when they kind of go on the mattresses. Bill drives to Arizona and then he gets arrested there as on like a material witness rap. And he kind of breaks down in a prison cell and interviews with an FBI agent and says, my father's been a Cosa Nostra leader since 1931. And he starts giving information throughout the war. And his kind of, and again, we can kind of go a little bit more, but before that, even there's some excerpts of interviews he did with FBI agents before that, where he doesn't like say, "Oh, I'm a member of La Cosa Nostra," but it's a lot of wink, wink, nod, nod. Like they kind of ask him questions, and he's like, "No, like does your family answer to a commission?" And they're like, he's like, "No, we're Casa Morese, like we deal with our own problems," or something like that. Like they ask him if he's a consigliere, and he's like, "No, but I can set policy." He doesn't say with a family, but he's kind of basically, I think he liked being coy with them, which I think other, like Magadino talks about it, and some other people on Wiretaps talk about, that the Bonannos kind of could get cozy with law enforcement. But
yeah, there's a part in Bill Bonanno's interview with the FBI where I think he finally kind of starts to share a little more than, I mean, he definitely breaks Omerta, and he says something to the effect of like, now you're going to make another Valachi out of
yeah,
it. But you'll never read about this in any of the Bonanno books. You'll never, because I mean, he was a full-on informant. Like, even if he was coy, like if you look at those reports, Bill was straight up informing about the inner workings of the organization. And
Yeah.
he wrote what, 3 books, two, 3 books. Doesn't make a single mention of the fact that he was a what they call a rat. I'm
Yeah.
happy I love when these guys cooperate, but
Mhm.
in that world, based on like the tradition and honor that they talk about, look at what Bill was doing.
Yeah, in the part of the books that gets the closest. So I think the reason, well, I think he broke down probably because the time that he did was like everything was falling apart. It's probably just more of emotional vulnerability than anything. But when I kind of started to piece together the reports through various FBI files, you kind of start to see, I think he started to angle to try and get his father a good deal, because, and we haven't even touched on the kidnapping yet, but Bonanno was essentially a fugitive for a while. Like he absconded from justice essentially because he was supposed to appear before a grand jury. But I think Bill kind of, because they're in different reports from informants, it says Bill, it's always written like this informant says that Bill Bonanno told him, and you can just kind of take out those parts and just say Bill Bonanno said. That it's like, oh, if the FBI could promise Joe Bonanno would only serve a year on a obstruction of justice charge, Bill Bonanno could produce him in 5 days. And in his Bound by Honor book, he does kind of talk about this negotiation with the FBI to try and have his father surrender. But again, like you said, Eric, he doesn't talk about what he was giving them in order to try and work out that deal. So it never actually worked out because, as is what kind of well known, he just shows up in a courthouse and says, "My name's Joe Bonanno. I believe you're looking for me." And that was basically so the FBI wouldn't be able to arrest him. It was through the federal marshals. But yeah, he talks about it in a way, but removes a lot of context of those negotiations and what he was giving up.
So let's backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
Because like you mentioned a minute ago how Joe Bonanno lost his recognition as boss. What month? September 64? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So he loses his recognition, and you were talking about the politics of this. This isn't just I'm the boss and that's it. It's the commission has to recognize you. If they stop recognizing you, you're not the boss. We sometimes see in reports that Joe Bonanno was the boss until 1968 because that's when the war was going on. But he actually is no longer the boss of what's called the Bonanno family as of late 1964. So what happens then? What's and between that and the kidnapping, because we'll get into the kidnapping, there's a lot there, but between him losing recognition and the kidnapping, what's your estimation of what was going on?
So yeah, I definitely think they resisted for, yeah. So I'd say there's about a month. It's like late September, and then the kidnapping is in late October. It's roughly about a month where he is, the recognition was removed, but he's still fighting it. Rick, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add, that we shouldn't forget also that in 1965 that the author Gate DeLeese met Bill Bonanno on the courthouse steps, and they developed a relationship that led to the book Honor Thy Father that was published in 1971.
Mm-hmm.
So it has been long known that Bill was giving out information. The fact that that he gave so much and he put so much out there in a book. I mean, it actually caused a conflict between him and his father.
Yeah.
Before his father published his own book in 1976. But we learned a lot also from that book. There's, giving his side of the story.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point, because it's easy like to find this file where it says explicitly that Bill Bonanno, admitted being a mafia member, but you're right. Like he admitted that in the 60s, just in a different format. And Yeah, that's a good point. And that book too is another one where it kind of helps give you another, it's still, Bonanno, it's still from the Bonanno's point of view, but it definitely is still part of that, part of like the, not mythologic, like popularizing this story is definitely that book.
Yeah, so going back to that window of time when Bonanno is deposed, we know from the DeCavalcante tapes that it wasn't just that Joe Bonanno lost standing. The commission sent out word that any Bonanno member, all Bonanno members who failed to fall in line with the commission's edict could not be recognized. They were essentially shelved, and families were barred from doing not just criminal business, but even legitimate business with them. An example came from the Cavalcante tapes where there was a guy, Nino Bisciglio, who was a Sicilian, he was made in Sicily, came to the US, very close to the DeCavalcantes, but he was a Bonanno member along with his uncle. And Sam's like, I gotta fire him from the union. The DeCavalcante local 394. He's like, Nino can't work for us. He's a Bonanno member. So these guys are not just being barred from criminal relationships with Bonanno members. They can't even allow them to work labor jobs in this union. And so that provides this massive incentive for Bonanno members to fall in line and say, he's not our boss. Because we can see like Ziccarelli, he was like, this is our father. This is our boss. And he's very close to DeCavalcante, but he initially doesn't understand, and he wants to, apparently most of the guys stayed loyal for that first little month or two, it seems like, right?
Yeah, and I definitely think goes back into, it wasn't like, oh, Bonanno was like ripping off guys or killing them, or they seem to generally like him. It was just the politics made it. And I think that's a very interesting thing about this war is you see the mechanisms of the commission at play, where like you said, it's about the recognition. If they don't recognize you, where does that leave you and your family? What status does that give you? So that kind of pressure is very interesting. It's not like, you better fall in line or we'll kill you. It's like, no, you're just not going to be recognized. You can't gain access to the network that we have, which just kind of says so much more about the mafia as an organization and the politics. But yeah, it was more of that, more of the economic pressure that put a lot of guys in line with the commission. And it seems like, even by the time of Bonanno's disappearance, most of the family had kind of fallen behind the commission. And real quick, before we could get into the disappearance, I guess we should call it, on the DeCavalcante tapes, they do talk about how Bonanno does eventually formally resign in December. So at that point, he's in contact with at least like Joe Notaro, who was the Bonanno captain who took over from Carmine Galante, and who was Ziccarelli's captain at that time as well. He says that Bonanno formally resigned and that they're going to try and actually work with the commission. So for the good 4 months, Bonanno kind of held on to the title, at least among himself and his loyal followers, before finally himself kind of breaking to the commission.
Yeah, and what I find very interesting, and you've helped kind of flesh this out, where a lot of the guys who were diehard Bonanno loyalists, other guys fell in line. They were like, "Oh, this is what the commission said. Well, I guess I got to go along." They might not have wanted to, like Ziccarelli, but a lot of these guys who remained the diehard loyalists initially, and then even later, were from Carmine Galante's original crew. Galante's often labeled an admin member, but he wasn't. He was just a very powerful Cappuccino with members in Montreal, every borough of New York, some guys in New Jersey. And so these former Galante crew members, some of whom are now under Notaro, they're the guys who are behind Bonanno. But a lot of these guys are Bonanno talks about his Castellamarese tradition, but a lot of these guys are the lowest level of hoodlum. Like they have rape charges in their youth. They have their robbery. Like these are hardened criminals who came up under Galante. And it's not the Castellamarese. The Castellamarese seem to have fallen in line with De Gregorio and the commission. It's these other guys outside of Bonanno's relatives. So that's an interesting side of this, that these are the guys who are Bonanno's, the guys who stayed true to him.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting. Like, well, even in the Natara crew, Galante Natara crew, they were kind of split because you had Mike Consolo, who took over after Nataro. He was kind of a Di Gregorio guy. Frank Mari, who, himself tried to take over the family and didn't end too well for him. But he was a strong, it's hard to say Di Gregorio supporter, but he was just, I guess, more anti-Bonanno. And there was this hangout on the Lower East Side called the Park View Tavern. LCN Bios does a write-up of one of the members, Patsy Gigante, and he ran that bar. He was in that crew. But it was kind of this hangout for the Lower East Side element, and they were all kind of anti-Bonanno. But then, like you said, still, like the other half of that crew, like Vito Di Filippo, Joe Notaro, they really held on to Bonanno. But also with the Castellammarese, that's again a really good point. And the kind of Castellammarese element kind of has collapsed by the early 60s. Galante's in jail, so is Natalia Evola. John Tartamella is sick, who's the consigliere. He's falling ill. A couple others, his uncle, John Bonventry, moved to Italy. So he kind of loses a lot of that element. But the ones who kind of stayed true to him were more relatives, like his brother-in-laws, his other uncle, Vito Bonventry. They kind of held on to, they still supported him, even though it was more kind of financial or more like moral support as opposed to like gunmen. He did have some of his report, but that was just more about the family. But you're right, like the non-family Castellammarese, non-Bonanno extended family abandoned him right away.
And then Montreal, of all places, they're the hardcore pro Bonanno faction as well, which is strange. They're under Vic Catroni. They were originally under Galante, but then they split off. But even after splitting off, because there's a Megadino tape where he says he talks about Bonanno inducting guys in Canada without permission. And he says Bonanno was allowed to make 10 members there. So the commission approved 10 members. But then Megadino says he made another, I don't know, 10, close to 10 guys in not just Montreal, but also Ontario, which is Megadino's territory. So there's up to 20 guys in Montreal, but for whatever reason, that crew is also very close to Bonanno, and they stay with him through the end of the war, from what I've seen.
Drawing back to what you said previously about how Bonanno's loyalists were his relatives, and then this newer Americanized element, whereas the Castellammarese, they towed the line. That's a similar parallel to what went on back in 1920 with the breakup of the Corleonese family. Morello had his relatives, and then he had his mainlanders. The Corleonese and guys from Maranello and that whole interior area, they all went Lucchese. And another thing about Montreal, I recently came across this in John Dickey's book, is that the Calabrian members of the Montreal Decina did not approve or like that Sicilians could just arrive and transfer in. They wanted a rule to be implemented that they would have to wait 5 years before being able to do a formal transfer.
Yeah, it's a great comparison with the Morello situation. Even though the Bonanno family didn't split into two formal new families like that, very similar. The factionalism is almost identical. Great point.
Mm-hmm. As much as interested as I am in the Bonannos, the Montreal crew is still such a mystery to me. I've read a couple of the other books, but yeah, it's I had remember reading that about the division between the Neapolitans or the Sicilians and non-Sicilians. So it's interesting. Yeah, and that's another interesting about the Bonannos is they kind of maybe get presented as more Bonanno himself presents it as one of the conservative families. And certainly a lot of them were made along, Eric, you kind of mentioned earlier, like clan ties or extended family. But then there was this large part of it that were just like street hoodlums who had street rackets and were very violent guys. So you definitely see both sides of it.
Yeah, because within the Castellammarese, you certainly had hoodlums, but then you have guys who were doctors. You had guys who were, you mentioned one of Joe Bonanno's brothers-in-law. I don't know if you said his name, but is it Spadero?
Yeah.
He's an ostensibly legitimate businessman, very, very a welcome figure in legitimate society. He's also a made member of the Bonanno family. Martin Bonventuri is Joe Bonanno's first cousin. He's a doctor and an amico nostro. So, the traditional Sicilian side is kind of everybody, but then these other recruits that stay loyal to Bonanno are much more the hoodlum racketeer element.
But I think it's so interesting. It's such a small thing, but during his disappearance, and there were more grand juries investigating specifically the Bonanno family, Spadaro did get grand juried, and the Daily News published his name, saying, I don't think they called him a member, but just in saying that he got called with other Joe Notaro and Frank Mari, these really hoodlum guys. They kind of associated with him, and then a little while later, they do publish a redaction saying, we didn't mean to say that he was maybe a criminal. And I don't know if he actually was super criminally active. I think he picked up money for Bonanno, payments from shops, and he was involved in more white collar, glad handing and backroom deals, I think, with the garment industry. But that just was his reputation at the time. I mean, he had a social club that would put on these kind of Christopher Columbus Day dinners that had mayors and presidential candidates as attendees. So anyway, just a quick little thing about him. But I think that's the mafia that Joe Bonanno wants to portray, is the very legitimate.
I believe he was married to Joe Bonanno's wife's sister.
Yeah, because the Labrizzo family, they had a bunch of daughters, and each one, or at least the ones that I've most of the ones who married, he got into his orbit somehow.
So I feel like we should go into the kidnapping.
Yeah,
we've been dancing around the infamous kidnapping. We know in Joe Bonanno's book, in his telling, he devotes this wild chapter to this, because we know, what he was. Well, maybe you could just go into it. What was the actual kidnapping? What happened?
So, and it's something I haven't read up too much on, because I'm more interested in the politics and the kind of mafia stuff. But basically, he and some lawyers take a cab to one of the lawyers' buildings, and when he gets out, two guys kind of, it's like an old movie. They're like, you're coming with us, Joe. And they have a gun, and they bring him to a car, and the lawyer's stop, you can't do that. And then they shoot at his feet, and then the car drives away. So it's kind of it's obviously a big story, because Joe Bonanno was a pretty well-known figure at that time. Even before they kind of figured out that there was this internal split happening, he was at Appalachian. His name got kind of published as a racketeer. So it's kind of a big story. And then there's all these rumors about he's dead, he's alive, it's real, it's not. In some kind of contemporary FBI reports on it, it seems like a lot of informants said that no one really had any idea what had happened. But eventually it kind of gets pieced together that the informants, it's so redacted, it's hard to tell kind of who's who, but the general consensus is that on the street, at least, they largely think it was faked, because it's Joe Bonanno, he would have had bodyguards. He wouldn't have let himself be taken away that easily. Apparently, they said he carried a gun. So it seemed very quickly, whether it was real or not, people kind of started to feel like it was faked.
Yeah, I know Willie
Dara. If I may just say real quick, the FBI concluded that it was fake because, in their opinion, when somebody gets murdered, they don't ever talk about it. The name does not come up on wiretaps. But in Bonanno's case, everybody was talking about it, even in the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know Willie Dara, who was a Bonanno member that informed. He was an extended cousin of Mike Sabella, who everybody knows. I think he told the FBI if he was really kidnapped, he'd be dead.
Mm-hmm.
They don't kidnap someone and let him go. He would be Lupara Bianca, it would be a murder.
Found in a car. Yeah.
And there's a Megadino tape from that day, because in Joe Bonanno's book, he says, of course, he was kidnapped by Megadino. It's this very elaborate story, which, if it's fantasy, it's some amazing creative writing, because it's elaborate. He goes into detail about all these conversations they had. But there's because Megadino's office and his relatives' offices were bugged, as we've talked about a lot, and there's wiretaps from that day where nothing seems to be amiss, and they, you could say they were hiding it, but this is Megadino's inner circle, and there's not even a hint that there was anything going on until they learned about what happened in New York that day.
Mhm.
So the idea that like Megadino's relatives were down in New York violently kidnapping him doesn't match those wiretaps. I understand that's not the be all end all, but still, I think it's a piece of evidence in this.
Definitely. And one thing too, well, so one of the lesser known Bonanno captains is this guy named Anthony Di Giovanna, who was close to Frank Labrizio, and then kind of seemed, and this can maybe kind of transition to how Di Gregorio eventually becomes boss, but he kind of seems to have switched sides from ostensibly Bonanno to Di Gregorio. But he was interviewed by the FBI, and I think he didn't deny knowing Bonanno. He said that, yeah, because Anthony Di Giovanna was in the bakery business, and one of the Arizona members came to him with Bonanno to kind of ask for a loan to help pay for some equipment. Anyway, they asked him about the kidnapping, and he says he thought it was fake because, quote, or he thought it was phony because, quote, that, and they say expletive, but I'm sure they mean fuck. That fuck's been phony since the day he was born. So there definitely was this kind of sense of like, it's Bonanno, like he's kind of dramatic. He's probably faked it. But I always liked that quote.
Yeah. Well, he kind of is, because I mean he's very slick.
Yeah.
He's not an obvious gangster. He's Maranzano. We've talked about that before. I think if we want to understand what Salvatore Maranzano was like, I think we can look at Joe Bonanno as a pretty good example. That's how he learned it. That's how he learned to be the way he was in the mafia. So Joe Bonanno. So he's deposed. He loses recognition. There's this, what most people believe to have been a fake kidnapping, despite what Joe Bonanno says. Who's running the Bonanno family in late 1964?
So this is something that again comes up in the D Cavalcanti tapes, where they start talking about these committees, and that's something that we see later, like in more modern families, where you have these panels, these committees kind of running the family. But during this time where they didn't have an officially selected leader, they had these panels or these committees. And it kind of gets a little confusing. It's a lot of like the captains of the time. So like Smitty D'Angelo, who gets inserted later into this. Joe Notaro, I think, was a part of it as well. Matty Valvo, who shows up later as well. This guy John Acaro, who is this kind of old-time Brooklyn captain. The Angelo Caruso, Nick Alfano, these kind of more recognizable names. They're kind of all running the family, but then there's this interesting debate, I guess, or just this miscommunication where they're helping run the family. They seem to assume that they're still captains, but the commission is saying, since there's no boss, there are no captains. You just happen to be committee members. So again, that's one of those other things where it's not so much like the war itself, but what it tells us, where the fact that the commission is saying there are no captains, you're just kind of blank members. And then once you have a boss, then you can start organizing yourselves again. And you see this in other times too, where a boss comes in, technically all the captains are supposed to step down, and then he appoints them back up.
Yeah, that's a tradition. Yeah. When a boss leaves office or dies or whatever else, deposed, the captains lose their rank, underboss loses his rank, consigliere can stay on. Mm-hmm. But in this case, it's Bill Bonanno, and they're not letting him stay.
Yeah. And actually, it's an interesting thing that they say on that Sam de Cavalcante says, is that when they remove a boss, and Joe Zicker really follows up, all three goes, which I never quite knew what to make. I don't know if he's just referring to that specific time or if there's other examples he's thinking of. But anyway, to answer your question, the three kind of men who kind of come out as the three kind of points of contact is Angelo Caruso, who was Salvatore Maranzano's brief underboss and one-time acting boss before Bonanno. this guy Nick Alfano, who's kind of another old time member who's based more in New Jersey and I think Yonkers, and then Gaspar Di Gregorio, whose situation kind of helped jumpstart this whole thing. So those three, I think they're described as being the ones who formally represent the rest of the family to the commission. And that kind of goes into late 64 to 65. And, the commission, I think officially on record is like, we're not supporting anybody. You guys kind of figure it out yourselves. But you can't separate the fact that Magaddino and Gaspar Di Gregorio were brothers-in-law. Like that, I don't think it's very clear that Magaddino, I think, helped, if not installed him, like helped push him for boss.
Blood cousins too. Their mothers were sisters on top of that,
Yeah, that whole, it's that clan work where they're all interrelated and they continue to be. But yeah, so then in 1965, Gaspar Di Gregorio formally becomes boss. I think it's also important to note at this time that the newspapers, because of the kidnapping or the disappearance, they start to get very invested into this situation. And there's pictures posted of when they go to the restaurant to, I think, formally recognize Gaspar Di Gregorio as boss. They print photos of like, I think, Bunzi Thierry coming out of the restaurant, some Bonanno members, and they post it in the newspaper. So it's kind of starts becoming a spectacle, which I think will add to Di Gregorio's kind of inability to formally insert himself as boss.
You mentioned Angelo Caruso. The FBI got some information that the reason Sam DeCavalcante wasn't on the commission, but we know from his tapes he's playing this essential role mediating the early stages of the war. And we call it a war, but at that point, there's no shooting to speak of. But the FBI learned that the reason Sam DeCavalcante got so invested in it is because his father, Frank, who had been a DeCavalcante family captain, was the best friend of Angelo Caruso. And when Sam tried to contact Bonanno, he said something to him like, "You're not the man your father was." So Frank DeCavalcante was apparently this very close, he's a mysterious guy, but apparently he's this very close friend of Bonanno and Caruso. So that's why he's involved, apparently. Just an interesting angle.
And I'm not sure of the geography, but Caruso had his own ties to New Jersey. His brother-in-law was apparently his captain before he got Joseph Coletti. Joseph. He was based in, I think, Lodi, New Jersey. Again, I'm not sure of the exact geography, but they had ties to New Jersey as well. So that's definitely no coincidence. Yeah, and again, I'm going back to we call it a war. It doesn't really get super violent until the very end. It really flares out at the end. But for most of it, I think an informant described it as like a war of nerves, where it's this kind of weird standoff where the Bonannos try to insert themselves into the family more and more, and the commission or Di Gregorio and the commission is trying to balance that by maintaining their authority over the family. So I think go ahead.
I was going to say, when does Di Gregorio become official boss?
I think it's like early 1965, but then I think he like very quickly has a heart attack, and then Mike Sabella, as you mentioned, Eric, who everyone kind of knows, he's mentioned in Donnie Brasco. He briefly takes over as acting boss, but also I think by June of 1965 is when Di Gregorio kind of officially starts acting as boss, where he's making appointments, he's making new captains, he's kind of formally stepping into the role.
Yeah, it'd be around the time that on the DeCavalcante tapes, he says the West Coast members are supposed to be transferred to the LA family, but now Gaspar is trying to like appoint Joe Genovese as the captain, who is Bonanno's in-law. His son, Genovese's son, married Bonanno's daughter. So there's this initial plan. They also say that Montreal is supposed to be assigned to Magaddino. So there was a plan to transfer the remote crews, right, to other families. But then Di Gregorio's like, I'm going to keep him.
Yeah, he kind of holds on to him. And they mentioned that too, that he's kind of, he eventually said, or he agreed to it, but then is rescinding it. They don't really go into why. It's not sure if it was like a point of pride or just logistically they just never got around to it. But that's another interesting thing too, because I think before that they mentioned the decapitated tapes that those should belong to their respective, the nearest person in authority. So which would be like a Colorado or Arizona or California family for Arizona, and then Magadino for Montreal. But again, well, and I think going back to what I was saying about Magadino helping install Di Gregorio, that's kind of a maybe point against that, where if he was really beholden to Magadino, wouldn't he have given him Montreal? So definitely would have been a point of contention, I think, between them.
Makes you wonder
Is
if he saw through Magadino at a certain point that he didn't like him pulling the strings, especially once he became boss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. There's not really. I think Bill in his book talks about how their relationship had kind of cooled when Gaspar was boss. I think he says something about when Gaspar Di Gregorio's daughter gets married, I think in late 65, which again was another thing that kind of got a lot of press, is this wedding that Magadino didn't even go. And Bill kind of points to that as saying they grew apart. There was some kind of tension between them. So that could have been definitely part of it.
there are a lot of problems between these relatives because on the Megadino tapes, he talks about these serious problems he had had with John Bonventry. He hates his cousin Peter Megadino, who transferred from Buffalo and became a Bonanno loyalist in his family. So within the Bonanno blood and marital clan, there's all this bad blood. It's kind of funny to read because it's like we think of these guys, they're Castellamarese, they're all related. Half of them hate each other.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's the dynamic between Bonanno and Megadino is kind of the peak of that. And the way Megadino talks about Bonanno on there, I mean, even if you don't like your relatives, I mean, to talk about him that way, he calls he calls Bill Bonanno a wretched corpse again,
Mm-hmm.
a cuckold, all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. It could be kind of funny, but just, yeah, I think a lot of it is just very personal. It's that kind of myth of the Godfather where he says it's not personal, it's strictly business, but a lot of it is personal. A lot of it is based on these years and years of resentment or, bad, as you said, bad blood. I mean, I've kind of made this joke before, like between us, but I think the one thing that Bonanno and Magadino agree on is that Magadino was really pissed off at Bill Bonanno's wedding. And Magadino mentions it on a wiretap.
So where do you think the conflict between Magadino and Bonanno started? How far back does it go?
Ooh, I think Eric might be able to go into that because I feel like Magadino talks about that on his wiretaps. Um, I recall that I think even he's talking to Paul Shaka, who will eventually take over as boss in the late 60s, and or who we assume to be Nick Alfano. Or it might have been another wiretap, but he talks about Bonanno's own ascension to boss and how very quickly he kind of felt like Bonanno was like kind of trying to eclipse him maybe as kind of the premier Castellanese in the country. Yeah, I
Yeah, I got
think,
that impression too.
yeah, it's definitely like very personal. It's probably long brewing. And I know as Eric mentioned, the Magadino's he had some issue with John Bonventry, who was Bonanno's uncle, I guess Magadino's cousin or something. And then he just didn't like how Bonanno handled that situation. And the situation's not clear because it's through wiretap. So like they understand what he's talking about, but just through context, it's hard to gauge what exactly happened. But and then obviously Bonanno encroaching in what he considered his territory in Canada kind of really yeah, so it's kind
Yeah,
of like a lot of things over many, many years.
on those tapes, you just mentioned the wedding thing, and what I find really funny comparing and contrasting the Megadino tapes, which to me are like an amazing book to read through if you can understand them. But they actually complement Bonanno's story very well in some cases. Aside from the
Mhm.
kidnapping, you mentioned the wedding where like Bonanno says, "Oh, Megadino was really upset that Bill Bonanno's wedding was a national event where bosses came from all over. Like Megadino felt like I was trying to show him up. You read the Megadino tapes and he's like, oh, in the wedding, he was trying to show me up, whatever he says.
Yeah.
But there's also a thing where he like you said, he seems to have felt like Bonanno was ungrateful for Megadino supporting him as a young boss. And he mentions like when Bonanno moved to Arizona, which I think was in the 40s,
Hmm.
he's like, I was the one who held his family together when he wasn't around. There's also he said Bonanno says in his book how Megadino resented Bonanno for being more educated. And then sure enough, on the Megadino tapes, and he's like, and he thinks because he's educated, he thinks he's so much better than me. It's like all those resentments, like they agree on. It's just they
Hmm.
come from different sides.
Yeah, that's really interesting that. Yeah, I kind of forgot about the educating thing or it's interesting that he says I'm the one that held his family together. I do wonder what the more what kind of he means by that or what kind of examples. Because again, like it's very interesting that Bonanno was largely absent. Well, it seems largely more absent for 10 plus years going into this, and he was still very revered, and the family still liked him. It wasn't like they're like, "Who's Joe Bonanno?" They really felt like he was a good boss, and he was there for them. Or I don't know, there for them might not be the right thing, but yeah, he spent time in Arizona. He traveled a lot. He went to Sicily. But somehow he was able to keep the family aligned with him until politically he couldn't anymore.
One thing about the Bonanno family is they've also utilized throughout their history panels.
Mm-hmm.
These panels are different than the consiglio that we talk about in Chicago, Tampa, and other cities. This panel was almost like an administration panel composed of specific captains. The Bonannos seem to have a history of using panels within their structure. We see that in the 1960s. We see that again in the 70s and 80s under Rastelli. And then we see that even more recently with Joe Messino.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's not like a sign of the times. It was something that was built in and used periodically, as you said. I mean, fast forwarding just a bit, in the late 60s, kind of after all this has kind of settled, the Nick Marangelo, better known as Nicky Glasses, again from kind of Donnie Brasco, an informant describes him as a senior captain, which, kind of could be like a colloquial term, but it's definitely some kind of position in a way where he's kind of seen as a higher echelon of captains when in theory they should all be equal, I feel like.
Going back to Skiro back in the 1910s and 20s, he did a lot of traveling as well. And
Right.
one SS informant identified Benny Gallo as the boss of Williamsburg. We know
Mhm.
that's not true, but it could be very possible that Skiro had some kind of panel or at least some acting authority in place while he exclusively traveled. So we don't know the extent of it and if it's even how it relates, but that family does seem to have a extensive history of doing something like that.
Mm-hmm. Kind of being a little bit more, I don't know, self-reliant I'm not sure is the right term, but they don't need someone like right there all the time, which, yeah, it's very interesting. I don't think that's a coincidence that Bonanno was able to be away from that long. I mean, Shiro was able to do the same thing. He probably had seen it or heard it and was like, oh, I can kind of set this up while I'm off in Arizona or going to Montreal or, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of the traditional role of the rappresentante, as they called the boss representative, as a political office where just like we see in legitimate politics, you know, the actual politician doesn't need to be in his jurisdiction. He's a representative. In Philly, they had a couple early bosses who lived in North Jersey, but were the bosses of Philly. But I want to go back to that. You mentioned that senior captain thing because that comes up in the Donnie Brasco case too, where Lefty says to Pistone, he says they made Sonny Black the top captain. Every family has a top captain, but for whatever reason, it comes up more in the Bonannos.
Mhm.
So they seem to have had a designated captain who was kind of almost like a street boss who helped run the family. And there's a reference we've talked about before where someone thought Carmine Galante was on a panel, which might explain why everybody thought he was an admin member. He was a captain, but maybe this senior captain, top captain thing was something Galante held as well. But
Yeah, that seems like something that he morphs in terms of like the size of his crew and just the fact that so many of them ended up becoming important members later on. It definitely seems like a role he could have inhabited. Actually, one thing too with the Bonannos, rewinding just a bit, that captain I mentioned earlier, Anthony Di Giovanna, when Frank Labrizio was kind of starting to step into becoming an acting boss, he calls him his contact man. Basically, like if someone in the family needs to get in contact with Labrizio, they would go through Anthony Di Giovanna, who at that point was a captain as well. So he could have definitely inhabited that role, and they just kind of might have used a different term. But yeah, it's definitely something that it seems like there was this extra layer of insulation, maybe not insulation, but this extra person between the boss or administration and the rest of the captains.
Yes, a similar thing does seem to exist in other places, like in Chicago in the 1970s with Joe Ferriola being a captain, but seemingly, some people thought he was the boss, because of his role in that family. When we found out later on that others were actually the boss at the time. So, that's just one example, but there's others. So it wasn't unique, but maybe the Bonannos used it more.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that idea of the street boss, that's a term that gets thrown around a lot. If you actually look into what that person typically does, some people assume it means acting boss or essentially an admin member. It seems to be more like a high level messenger, like a liaison between the administration and the other captains. So that's my take on what a street boss is. And this top captain, senior captain, what they had in Chicago seems to be similar.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing I notice about the structure is that new ranks are not implemented. That's why you have lieutenants being called acting captains or, something similar. When you hear acting captain, you would assume that Capodicina is away and that this one is serving as, one on the interim or one on a limited basis. But apparently, no, a captain is allowed to utilize an acting captain. And even with these panels, there's never been like a formal name for it, or even top captain, if those if those existed. They were never given their own new rank within the mafia structure. The only one that might, and even then, we don't even have this confirmed, was with the Genovese's Messaggero, which you hear about later on. It hasn't been made into like a formal rank that's constantly existing. It seemed like an informal function carried out by one of the captains or an admin member.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, back to the Bonannos.
No, but that's a really good point, that even though, officially they might hold like a certain rank, operationally they can do much more. Like a captain can oversee, like I think Neil Della Croce, like he was a captain, but oversaw other captains, I think. I kind of might be getting that wrong.
Yeah, there's an Angelo Bruno tape where this is before Neil is the underboss, and he says he's the capo di Cina di capo di Cina. So it's like he's saying he's a captain of all captains. So it's like he's like the head of a faction of other captains within the family, like a de facto leader of that group. So good point.
Yeah. So again, well, and then like as you bring it back to the Bonannos, like he definitely could have utilized something like that while Bonanno was gone. Going back to the actual split, it does seem like by 1965, when Di Gregorio becomes boss officially, the Bonanno faction kind of goes into kind of like a stasis. I think Bill is in jail on a contempt charge, which will plague many more members throughout the next couple of years. Contempt basically being the refusing to testify in front of a grand jury. But it's kind of like the peak of his power. This mid 1965 to 1966, when Bill does kind of start, when Bill gets out on the street again, he starts to kind of organize and starts to kind of try to work within the DiGregorio family, or not work within it, but just kind of, he starts to operate again. There's an informant, I think, who says that he shows up. I mentioned earlier the Parkview Tavern, which was kind of this hub for anti-Bonanno sentiment. Like he shows up there, I think around Christmas time, just to say like Merry Christmas, but it's so clearly to me, it just seems like a kind of flaunt, just to kind of say I'm still here. So he kind of starts maneuvering in late 65 to 66, which I think will culminate in the Troutman Street shooting, which I guess there's kind of three big events in this: the disappearance, Troutman, and then the Cypress Gardens killings later on. But the Troutman Street shooting is a pretty big moment. It's the first, it's always been referred to as the opening salvo of the war, even though these tensions have been brewing for some time. But as you guys may know, or as other people might know, but just to kind of recap, well, an interesting thing about Troutman, and I kind of wrote something on the Black Hand Forum where we all kind of congregate. So in the books, it kind of gets presented as a peace meeting, that they're going to settle their differences and finally come together. But the contemporary reporting, I think that comes from Bill, because as we've talked about, he was an informant by this time. He was starting to give information about Bonanno members, the makeup of DiGregorio's family. I should also say too, DiGregorio's setup. So he has him as boss, one of his crew members as Peter Crociata as his underboss, and Paul Shaka as consigliere. Paul Shaka was a member of the Galante crew and will eventually obviously become boss later on. So Bill's kind of giving information about DiGregorio's setup. And after Troutman, he kind of gives a breakdown of what happened. Basically, they're talking, at this time, it's kind of more about territory. There's some gambling issue in Brooklyn. They were about some territory they owned. And that was why they met up on Troutman Street. But the shooting happened as they leave. No one's hurt or killed or anything. It's just kind of a couple, shots back and forth. That kind of reintroduces the media interest and the law enforcement interest to where the grand jury summons start coming again. Which kind of, it seems like the grand juries kind of simmer the tensions because they can't move because they're having to be in court all the time or going to jail on contempt charges. And what's interesting too is that there does seem to be another olive branch where at some point in mid-1966, Peter Crociata, who I mentioned just a moment ago, gets taken down as underboss. And as kind of again, olive branch, there seem to be some talks of Joe Notaro becoming the underboss to kind of really formalize the family again. But I think, he dies in May 1966, just right after Joe Bonanno reappears. And those kind of tensions will kind of continue on through 1966 into 1967.
Now, did you see meddling with other families? Because in the FBI files, I think it mentions that Dela Croce supported some people in the factional groups. And later on, I believe Jerry Katina ended up supporting the Bonanno side. So in your research, did you see any kind of meddling?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I haven't really seen those reports. So I'd be interested. That's in Neil Dela Croce's file.
It's either in his file or it's about him in other files because a lot of times these reports are mixed up.
Yeah. The one thing I did see recently was in the Gambino Joe Gallo file. There's after Bonanno comes back, they're selling tickets. It's such kind of an old timey thing where they're selling tickets to a dance to try and raise money for the Bonanno cause. And Joe and Gallo bought a couple tickets or however many, whether that's hey, we're supporting your side, or more just, okay, we'll buy some here. I'm not sure. But yeah, I don't know if because by this time Lucchese's getting sick, it seems like the commission's kind of gotten over more and more the crusade against Bonanno, I guess, maybe how they would phrase it. Um, I haven't seen much where like what you talked about at the beginning, where Gambino actually harbored some of the Gallo members in the Profaci family, the rebel Gallo brothers. I haven't seen that much about other families meddling into the Bonanno War. Um, I could be forgetting some things, or definitely there could be more that I haven't seen. But I haven't gotten the impression that other families have kind of interfered as much.
It seems like
But it's interesting
Megadino.
that,
Seems like
yeah,
Megadino. I think the commission kind of allowed Megadino to take charge in that, but then we know Megadino's family had a coup in early 1969 where they tried to depose him. So, funny enough, his power didn't last very long. I mean, I think he remained the official boss, but there were other guys running Buffalo after late 1968. I want to go back. You mentioned Crociata getting demoted. He gets shot at some point, doesn't he?
yeah, that's like in late or 1968, like so after the Cypress Gardens murders, which we can kind of lead up a little bit more to that, for like 4 or 5 months after that happens in November of 67. There's a couple like shootings and then a couple more killings, but he gets shot at during the intense period in 1968. I think by then I feel like I've seen some files where he's mentioned as like a maybe acting consigliere, but I'm not sure what exactly, if he was still involved, like intimately involved with the family at that time. But definitely he's still a very high rank, or maybe, yeah, I guess high ranking member at that time, even if he might not have been an official admin member.
Then his cousin, like Frank Crociata, gets shot too. And
Yeah.
I don't know his story. He's kind of a mystery, but he's apparently the cousin of Peter Crociata, and he gets hit or shot.
Yeah, and then he's like connected to Hank Perone, who gets mentioned a lot in the Bonanno books. He's kind of like Bill's kind of number one, or I guess number two guy. Like he's his number two. He like there's a key found on Frank Crociata that's tied to a garage that Hank owned. So it seems like he might have been on that side, but it's not very clear. There's not that much that talks about his role in the FBI files that I've seen, other than that connection.
Yeah, so this is when the actual war starts. It's like the early stages, which I'm more familiar with. Like I've studied the DeCavalcante tapes and this stuff in 64 and early 65, but then that's the kind of a Cold War, and then this hot war comes out later. You
Yeah.
mentioned that the Bonanno group had been kind of sidelined. There's some legal trouble, but now guys start getting killed. And you mentioned Consolo. He gets killed, right?
Yeah. So I guess kind of rewinding just a bit. So Di Gregorio, where did he left off? So 66 is kind of another part of the cold period, but then Di Gregorio formally gets removed sometime between 1966 and 67. And by that point, Bonanno is already back on the scene. He gives himself up after being gone for, I think, 18 months. He gets out on bail. He's living at Bill's house. That's another thing, too. It's like for the first part of the war and during the main disappearance, like Bill, Joe, Notaro, Frank Fabrizio, they're all kind of on the mattresses, so to speak. They're living in this apartment in Queens. But for the most part, until even during the shootings, it seems like everyone's just at home. Like they're not actively thinking things are going to happen. But Joe's living at Bill's house. But they slowly start to try to gain their power back. So one thing that Joe Bonanno does is he reaches out to Angelo Caruso. And from what I remember, what I read, I think he literally accosts him on the street being like, "You still belong to me. Like, I'm your boss. Like, you still belong to me." And he's like, we have to bring it up to the council, which is another example of Bonanno's using some kind of formal panel or committee. I think they called it a council of six who helped Di Gregorio run the family. So, but they eventually get Caruso back. think they probably get a couple others, but they're really kind of starting to make their move to become the dominant force again. So there's this really confusing time in early 67 where at first it's like Joe Zaccarilli is going to be boss with Angelo Caruso as like an underboss and Vito Di Filippo as an underboss. And just kind of flips flops between those three and then Paul Sciacca, who's the commission favorite. So after Di Gregorio gets brought down, Sciacca then kind of becomes the main uniting force of the anti-Bonanno faction. So, it's and Zaccarilli kind of, I guess, comes back to the Bonanno folds, maybe unwillingly. Seems like he's kind of caught in the middle and he doesn't want to be involved, but they keep kind of forcing him as a potential candidate, like a puppet. But Paul Sciacca eventually gets the job in late 67, and he selects as his consigliere Smitty D'Angelo, who was originally a Bonanno loyalist, who's close to John Morales, who was Bonanno's underboss for a time. Because he gets selected as a consigliere, he had left the Bonanno faction. And one thing I saw that was pretty interesting is a contemporary report stated that one of the reasons for so Smitty D'Angelo, his brother, and another associate get killed at this restaurant. They get machine gunned to death. It's not funny, but it's just so dramatic. The shooter apparently was Gaspar Magaddino, who was a cousin of Magaddino and Bonanno. I didn't know this until when you guys talked with Jimmy Buccellato a few weeks ago. He brought this up as well, that he was apparently the boss of Castellamare del Golfo, who got brought here and ended up doing hits. And it's kind of there's so much more to that story than I think we know. But one of the reasons that the FBI kind of found that a potential reason is when Smitty D'Angelo was meeting with Bonanno, he apparently got so frustrated that he hit Joe Bonanno, like he slapped him in the face. And that just was kind of another thing that led to his murder, along with becoming not only going to the other side, but becoming an admin member for what the Bonannos consider the rebel side. So then that I think they call it a massacre. Three guys killed in a restaurant. That really kind of sets off this war part of it, this hot war.
It's interesting, because Gaspar Magaddino, like you mentioned, he was the boss of Castellamare before he came to the U.S. in the early 60s, and he killed another guy named Galante. Don't know if there's any relation. But then his brother is Peter Magaddino, who left Buffalo to join with Joe Bonanno. So it's another example of all the problems within the Bonanno clan, where this Stefano Magaddino is opposed to Joe Bonanno, but then Stefano's cousins, Gaspar and Peter Magaddino, side with Bonanno. Gaspar Magaddino goes from being a boss to committing brutal hits in New York. It's a wild story.
Yeah. And kind of like you said, Eric, like the first part of the war is kind of, that's the stuff I kind of find more interesting. The more the murders and the shootings, I don't really read up as much, but yeah, there's a couple more. You mentioned Mike Consolo. So as I mentioned before, Mike Consolo he eventually took over what was the Galante Notaro crew, which was this kind of sprawling crew over, New Jersey, New York, and Brooklyn. I think he actually got taken down as a consequence of the Troutman shooting. Apparently, the contract was given to him, and he gave it to Frank Mari, who he apparently bundled it, so he got taken down as a captain sometime in the years leading up. But he always gets described as a captain when he's killed. So he's killed, I think, in April of 1968. And the story goes in Bill's, I think, Honor Thy Father, and in Bill Bonanno's book, that they shook hands at some court, some grand jury investigation, and somehow that got interpreted as him going over to the Bonanno side. But I haven't seen anything like I think that is true that they were at a courthouse on the day that Consolo was killed, and I think that did happen. But I haven't seen anything kind of talking about his murder. It seems very murky of why he was killed or who was behind it.
Yeah, was it just a public? I mean, because these guys, we know even when these guys are at war, if they see each other, they'll act like friends. So it's like, was there more to it than a handshake? Is
Mhm.
kind of the question. Was
Yeah, because they
Consolo actually doing something behind the scenes?
yeah, because he had so if they wouldn't have just killed any member for shaking Bill Bonanno's hand. Like Consolo had to have been still very active or still very influential in the family for that to have been something of consequence. But yeah, it's no way does it kind of break down just to that. There has to be more to it. But then Bill's number two, as I mentioned earlier, Hank Perone gets killed. I can't remember now the exact order because there's just kind of so many shootings and killings. But he gets killed. Um, Real quick, kind of a quick side note about him. So as we talked about where Joe was making guys in Montreal and Arizona, there are reports that they were inducting members during the split. Um, again, the informant was almost certainly Bill Bonanno himself saying that, well, just, the commission won't recognize them, but when the bullets fly, it won't matter. So I think just making guys to kind of keep them loyal or give them that recognition, even if it was just internally. But I think Hank Perone was almost certainly one of those. I haven't seen anything directly saying that he was made, but if they were making guys, he would definitely be one of them. But then, yeah, I think by that point, this is kind of April 1968. I think Joe has a heart attack. The shootings don't go their way. Like they don't, they lose Hank Perone, which is a pretty big deal. Or he's kind of like the main shooter, I think, of the Bonannos. He was kind of one of the more active participants in the shooting war. And they just kind of culminates with them eventually just leaving to Arizona, like kind of bowing out. And then yeah, they end up in Arizona, but the Bonanno family still has internal issues for the next couple of years.
I want to go back to the Sicilian stuff because I know on the wiretaps, because I mean, this was the hottest gossip in the country, probably internationally at the time. And, the FBI had wiretaps in a lot of the bosses' headquarters
Mhm.
around the country. This is what they were talking about most of the time. They were getting directives from the commission. They were trying to figure out what Bonanno was doing. You can tell they're genuinely unnerved about Bonanno. Like, even though he has this small faction, you can tell they're genuinely scared of what he's capable of. And I know there's one of the rumors when he was kidnapped was that he was in Sicily. We see that his relative Megadino comes to the U.S. and helps kill people. Uh, Way later, that guy Luigi Roncesvalli, he says he met guys in Bushwick who had come to the U.S. to assist Bonanno, Sicilians who came and then just stayed. He mentions a guy who did that, and but we know that from Frank Fiordolino, like he said, his uncle John Fiordolino was a De Gregorio supporter. Like
Mhm.
he was, and so there are these other Sicilians who came here in the years before the war, and they side with De Gregorio, which is interesting. So even the Sicilians seem to have been divided based on the little we know.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, again, like that Luigi saying that is so interesting because, like I was saying just a moment ago, Hank Perone was kind of seemed like one of their main shooters. But then there's reports of Bill going around with guys from Texas and Arizona, like Carl Samari, who was another Bonanno supporter. He was originally from Buffalo, but was from the West Coast. So yeah, it's not like they're riding around with Sicilian bodyguards, like bodyguards. Seems like a very Americanized guys.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that and it's not like I don't think Rosenvalley made that up, but it's interesting where that came from. This idea that all the Zips are kind of imported to be gunmen for Bonanno. Maybe they were, but then they ended up being aligned with the Di Gregorio faction. Going back to Frank Ferdolino, there's a report, I think, from Bill Bonanno where he talks about John Fordolino and says that he's becoming more important as Di Gregorio gains stature. Like they had always been close. And he says something like he's been sent on some I don't know. When he says contracts, I don't know if he means actual killings or just like missions or like having him do jobs. But it seems like very supportive of Di Gregorio.
The thing
And
with Galante is he was considered the protege of Joe Bonanno, and
Mhm.
Galante has a fierce reputation. So he had to have learned it from somewhere.
Yeah.
And also, Galante's crew going forward, or the people that he made, including Joe Massino in a crowded restaurant by telling him he's a member. Joe Massino never went through the full ceremony. Much of what he did back in the 70s and 80s is the reason why that family is what it is today.
And even into the 60s and 70s, I mean, Paul Shaka, Di Gregorio gets brought down. Paul Shaka becomes the boss. Shaka was a Galante crew member. Rusty Ristilli was a Galante crew member. I think Nick Marangelo, who was the underboss under Ristilli, and then Galante when he was de facto boss. I think he was also part of that crew. So
And Ziccarelli too, right?
yeah, exactly. And Ziccarelli's, I could never really nail down what his exact rank was. He gets referred to as a capo regime, but definitely I think by the 70s he was. But in the 60s, when he referred to as a capo regime, I think in the early 60s, we know he was a Galante crew member. So it doesn't seem exact, but he was very involved in the internal politics of the Bonanno family.
And
So
it's
yeah,
interesting that Galante himself seemed to always support Joe Bonanno,
Mhm.
even later on when he was the de facto boss of the family.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I've seen you guys talk about where he was in contact with Joe Bonanno and maybe was sending him money. But
Yeah, there's an FBI report just months before Galante was killed where they were aware of telephone contact between Galante and Bonanno. So in a way, it's like Bonanno, while he might not have been calling the shots, you can see where Bonanno's influence was still present up until the late 70s when Galante is usurping control of the family.
Mhm.
And it's interesting also that the Bonannos threw Galante under the bus and during interviews they disowned him.
Yeah.
Barely mentioned him in the books. I mean, considering like he was inseparable from Bonanno really when he was on the street, and I think he gets mentioned in passing once in one of Bill's books. Joe Bonanno makes no reference to him.
Mhm.
Clearly, they didn't. I mean, Galante had a horrible reputation. He was a killer, a huge drug trafficker. I think the Bonannos strategically omitted him, in my opinion.
Mhm.
But his guys were all there. Those were his guys. Like they were. Galante was in prison, but he was still influencing things through the guys he recruited for sure.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the FBI before Bill became an actual informant, when he'd be interviewed by the FBI, I think he said something like, "We don't touch drugs," but they're like, "Well, how can you be associated with Joe Notaro, who was a close associate of Carmine Galante, who's in jail on narcotics charges?" And Bill just like just kind of shrugs his shoulders and just like, didn't he really respond to it? I don't remember, but yeah, like they like to pretend that they weren't really involved in that, but their close associates, the ones who really supported them, were very involved.
So getting to the end of the war, I guess, and I mean, it's not even clear to me what ended the war when the war was technically ended. We see Bonanno, like I mentioned earlier, we see people say Bonanno was no longer boss by 1968.
Mhm.
Paul Shaka becomes boss after Di Gregorio. What is going on in that period? Like that to me is a very confusing period.
Yeah, I definitely think, and it's hard to make out in general, but so I think I think in April of '68, the Bananas officially moved to Arizona. That's when they kind of all but surrender, I guess. They all kind of back out of the New York scene. But Shaka, I think, but there's still this kind of media interest and law enforcement scrutiny that, again, I think just like Di Gregorio, where it's like it's kind of hard to assert yourself when you're getting summons all the time. Newspapers are printing your name. I think the same thing happened to Paul Shaka. I mean, he gets like arrested on I think also a drug charge around that time, or I think later on in the '60s. But Shaka doesn't seem to have been able to, even with the Bonannos gone, to kind of bring the family together under him. there's still some simmering tensions or just inability to kind of get on the same page. But that's when Frank Mari, who was, the muscle behind Shaka and I think even Di Gregorio, he tries to make his move against. Well, even that's not even super clear of whether Shaka stepped down for a time. So this was in 68, or this was in 1969 by this time. So I think he was boss for maybe under 2 years, but Frank Mari kind of tries to make a move to become boss. And seems like to me the commission takes him out. He and his consigliere, Mike Adamo, just disappear. And by that time, and Natalia Evola or Evola, I can never remember how to say it. He eventually becomes the boss. Evola. But yeah, so it's just that's still a confusing time, the late 60s, even without the Bonannos. I don't know if that made it any clearer, but
Yeah, what I've read about Frank Mari, who's another Galante crew member, so it's like we can see that even the anti-Bonanno faction, like you said, included these Galante guys. But Frank Mari, a Bonanno member informant, said that Mari basically appointed himself the boss, probably when Shaka was having legal trouble, and that then he was lured to a house or something, or some sort of event, believing it was a commission meeting, and they killed him and apparently put him in a building. Apparently buried him in a construction site. Who knows if that's accurate, but he definitely does seem to be making a power play. And by all accounts was just an absolutely vicious guy. So, I mean, not surprising he was a liability if he wasn't doing something more like trying to take over the family.
Yeah. So yeah, and I've tried to do a lot of I actually tried to file for Frank Mari's FBI report, but because he's still technically considered missing, there's no death record for him, so they won't release it. But he's just a very interesting figure because he kind of comes up during this war and tries to make that play, and it ends very quickly. Like I think it's like a few days where the Bonanno member informant says, "Oh, Frank Mari's now the boss. Rusty Rostilli's is underboss. Mike Adamos is consigliere," and then like just a few days later, he disappears. So it's like they really nip it in the bud this time.
And then by then, Joe Bonanno's not a factor. Do you think that's after Joe Bonanno's out then?
Yeah, well, I think out of like the New York scene, because it seems like through the 60s and 70s, he's still trying to get back into La Cosa Nostra. Like there's many reports where he's talking to all these different members in different parts of the country, trying to get back in, essentially. They do try to take over California, or they try to still consolidate California in the 70s. They make moves into San Jose and try to basically reorganize themselves there, but it never really pans out.
Yeah, I've seen those reports throughout the entire decade of the 70s. Because I mean, Joe Bonanno's in Tucson, and the Bonanno members who are left on the West Coast are technically shelved Bonanno members still, but the FBI carries them as the Tucson family. We know there was never a recognized Tucson family. There was just sort of a de facto group under Joe Bonanno. But these informants, I mean, I have to say too, the Bonanno War was great for producing informants.
Yeah.
It made a lot of guys nervous. But there are these Tucson sources who are obviously very close to Joe Bonanno. I don't know if they're members or who they are, but they're telling the FBI everything he's saying, and he's coming up with plans, like you're saying, to take over the Bay Area, take over LA. Joe Bonanno's still trying to be a force, in the national mafia. Nothing ever happens, but he never gave up that dream of gaining power. I know that when the new Colorado boss, Scotty Spinuzzi, took over, the FBI learned Joe Bonanno contacted him and said, like, hey, I need your help getting reinstalled into Cosa Nostra. And Spinuzzi just didn't do anything. And so Joe Bonanno's reaching out to people. There's another report where when Stefano Megadino dies in 1974, Joe Bonanno reaches out again to Colorado, whose earlier boss, Jim Coletti, was the cousin of the Joe Coletti
Mhm.
the Bonanno captain. And Jim Coletti appears to have been a Bonanno member when he lived in New York. So he has this relationship to Colorado, but he reaches out to a Colorado member when Magadino dies, and he's like, he's happy. He's like, Stefano's dead. And he's like, I want you to reach out to Buffalo, like the new leadership in Buffalo, and get them to help me become at least recognized as a member or something, if not a boss. But again, nobody's willing to help Joe Bonanno at that point, you know.
Yeah, even though that like by that time, yeah, Magadino died, and even he lost power, as you mentioned earlier. Where his family had it, they had their own kind of split. Like Tommy Lucchese died, Carlo Gambino kind of just, I mean, he was still a very powerful figure, obviously, but I can't imagine he was still like actively working against Joe Bonanno. Like it doesn't seem like there was still that like we need to get him out feeling as there was in '64, but just no one's willing to kind of work with him. No one's willing to kind of put forth that effort to be like, hey, can we Joe Bonanno come back? Another thing too that's interesting about like just how they were operating is there's an informant in the 70s or a guy who flipped when Bill gets busted for some like real estate scam or some kind of thing he was doing in California. But there's a file where it reads that like they promised him to get made, the guy who flipped. So even in the 70s, they were still kind of operating as if they were still a Cosa Nostra family.
Didn't an
Like,
FBI report say that they had some kind of structure in Arizona?
Yeah.
I think so. I think it said like I think Peter, like, because there's two Peters who followed Bonanno to Arizona. Peter Magadino, who Eric's mentioned before, who's the Stefano's cousin, and Peter Notaro, who is Joe Notaro's cousin. I think one of them they said it was underboss, and this guy Vito Mule, who was this old member who moved to Arizona, I think in the 50s, was a consigliere until he died in the early 70s. Oh, and then I think there is another Tucson or one of the Tucson informants who was a member said that Bill told him that like you belong to me. Like I don't know if he said regime, but the informant inferred that he's saying that I'm in Bill's like regime or crew. And I think the other one would have been Charlie Battaglia, who was another Bonanno kind of loyalist who was kind of more of a street guy. But he was Battaglia was in jail in the late 60s, 70s, so I don't know how active he would have been. But
Yeah, Charlie
One of the two,
Battaglia regretted his decision later on, and he
yeah,
tried to go back to LA.
he's exactly like he was an LA member who transferred and apparently tried to, as Rick said, transfer back. I don't know if that ever went through.
No, it didn't.
Yeah. Again, probably
And
like we don't want to touch any former Bonanno members.
I want to get back to what you were saying about Joe Bonanno reaching out in the early to mid 70s, especially after Stefano Magadino's death and him being rejected. I think if you look at the timeline, it appears that this is what led to his decision to write the book, that there was nothing to stop him now, that, he probably always wanted to tell his story. I think the fact that his son was involved in a book earlier, that, that maybe he should tell the real story.
Mm-hmm.
And since he couldn't be back let in, he's just going to do it.
yeah, I think he was also losing a lot of his influence even in Arizona because around that time, one of the Tucson informants was like, he's still he's starting to become unpopular because he has so many demands and he expects so many favors and gratuities, but nobody's willing to do it anymore except for Peter Notaro. Like, so even in his own element, it seems like those guys were just done and they were kind of
Mm-hmm.
sick of his stuff, you know.
The
Right. Even
FBI,
the author of his book, Sergio Lally, years later, he was interviewed about writing a man of honor for Joe Bonanno. Joe Bonanno would tell him what to write basically, and he would make him work in order to get his cooperation to write to give him his story.
The FBI raided Joe Bonanno's house and they found an early manuscript. It was titled My Reign, 1939, oddly, until some other term. But I always wondered if that kind of catapulted him to just hurry up and publish this.
Yeah, I've seen the notes. I've seen the notes that they found, and it's very close to what he put in his book. It's like a very simplified form. There's a few questions, but for the most part, he pretty much says the same thing he ended up saying in the book. There was also so much legal trouble for Bonanno and his sons. Bill did prison time in the 70s. Joe Jr., who wasn't a member, doesn't appear to have been involved. I think he says that he kept Joe Jr. away from the life, if I remember right. But they were having serious legal issues in California and Arizona. I don't know what was going on in Joe Bonanno's life legally before the book, but I mean, he was still under a lot of scrutiny. We know he was still in contact with guys like he called Frank Bompensero at one point in the mid 70s and said, like, here's what's going on. I'm basically I'm mainly focused on Joe Jr.'s issues going to prison, and and then I think Bill always had some kind of ear issue, which is why he went to Arizona originally. And he's like, Bill just had like a surgery on his ear. It's like normal stuff that you'd talk about with your friends. But he tells Bob and Sarah, like, we're not going to be able to meet anytime soon because of this. So it indicates he's still, but the thing is, Bomp is an informant at that point for many years. Who knows if he would have been keeping that relationship to Bonanno if it wasn't serving his purpose with the FBI collecting info on Bonanno. We can't say that was a totally natural interaction, but he does seem to have contact with select members, especially on the West Coast. But I think they keep it under wraps. I don't think those members are going to their boss saying, "Hey, who I heard from the other day? Joe Bonanno." I think I think it's just there's a relationship, but he's not recognized. Because I mean, the guy was a hub of relationships. They're not just going to die out that quickly.
Didn't he meet? I know Tony has talked about this, but didn't he meet with Spilotro?
Did.
Yeah, that's another very interesting, because what we talked about in the beginning, where Giacomo was talking, where they were kind of talking about Bill becoming this figure in the West that eventually kind of has this weird relationship with Spilotro. Yeah, I don't. Tony could definitely go into more about that, but
I just saw a report the other day because Detroit had a presence in Arizona. I just saw a report recently. I've never even heard of this guy. Maybe from you, Griffin. But was there a guy like not Spinuzzi, Spinelli?
Yeah.
It says like Spinelli is an LCN member who used to be with the Bonanno group, and now he's with like Pete Licavoli Jr. from Detroit. I don't know if he transferred or if that's just like he's just associating with Detroit guys now. But it made me wonder if some of those Arizona guys found a new home or something if they wanted to stay active.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that, because Sal Spinelli, he gets identified as a member. He's really young. So he is another one where I think if they were making guys, or since they were making guys during the split, he probably would have been made during as opposed to before. But there's this other informant who, and I've talked to Tony about this, who these two, I can't remember, I would have to look up their names again, but it's this father and son, like Chicago or outfit associates, who talked to a Bonanno member, and I guess that Bonanno member in Tucson had some, I mean, like you mentioned earlier, they all had kind of beef with Bonanno at some point, but they kind of try to like get this Bonanno member on their side to kind of maybe do some coup against the Bonannos or like take over something. I'd have to go back and read it. It's in Bill Bonanno's file, which is available on the FBI site. But that's just something interesting where these Chicago guys are kind of trying to turn this Bonanno member against Bonanno even further for some kind of coup or some kind of action against him.
Yeah, because we know Chicago had a very strong presence in the Phoenix area.
Mm-hmm.
Also overlap with Tucson, but historically Tucson was more Bonanno, but then you also have Detroit. You have a bunch of it was an open jurisdiction, but clearly Bonanno thought it was his.
And there is another member, I think this other Bonanno member who's in Tucson, an informant reported that he was really close to Licavoli, is the Detroit guy.
Pete like a volley.
Yeah, that he was really close to him because this Bonanno member ran into some like financial issues, and Licavoli is the one who actually helped him. Bonanno didn't help him at all financially. So even though he formally belonged to Bonanno, he was really close to Pete Licavoli. So you can already see that the Bonanno members in Tucson are kind of getting pulled into other directions, but still. Yeah, it's interesting about Sal Spinelli. Like, I wonder if that was a formal thing, if Bonanno would let him go, or if, like you said, is maybe more of an associate, like he's just associated with him.
It's funny, just a random personal story. This is my closest Cosa Nostra connection myself. But my mom she was friends with a couple out here, and the husband was an old guy. This is like 15 years ago, easily. He was in his 70s then. But it turned out he said and this guy, he wasn't like a bragger, he wasn't anything. He was just a random older guy. He said he grew up in Arizona, and so I don't know when this would have been, but he said that he got hired to do some odd jobs for Joe and Bill, and he said they owned a tavern. And one of the things he was asked to do was to transport liquor from the old location to a new location. And he kind of knew they were mafia guys, but he was absolutely terrified about this liquor. But other than that, he didn't claim to get any insight, but he did say he was at their house just doing something, some sort of labor, and he saw Bill like really like verbally abuse this accountant in front of everybody. And he said like Joe just like flew off the handle, and he thought he was going to attack Bill. Like the Joe was like, "Why would you do that in front of other people? Like, why would you disrespect him in front of a room of people like that?" I just thought that was interesting. Like he saw Bill just kind of pushing this accountant around. Who knows? It's this guy's story. It didn't seem unrealistic. He seems to have gotten some sort of just job. Who knows how he got it? But I was just like, that's my one connection. It does kind of fit our understanding. Like, you know, we know Joe Bonanno could be a wrathful guy, but he probably didn't like the idea of his son pushing people around.
Yeah,
Tells you
or
something.
that Bill kind of maybe thinking that, well, my dad's Joe Bonanno, I can talk to people this way. But Joe having this more tact, I guess, more social. I don't know if social tact might be the wrong thing, but just more like, no, like you, especially like you said, in front of other people. That's probably more of it, was you're letting your inner emotions. That's kind of like in The Godfather, where he, chastises Sonny for kind of saying what he's thinking to an outsider. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
There was another informant in Arizona who said, like, when Joe Bonanno was trying to get reinstated, he said, as for Bill, like, there's zero chance Bill will ever, like, it seemed like he was saying maybe there's a chance Joe Bonanno could become a member,
Mhm.
taken off the shelf again. But he's saying with Bill, there's a zero chance. Like, nobody will ever recognize Bill again. And that goes back to the 60s, where all these people around the country were saying, like, seemed like Bill was seen as the real problem because he met with people and stuff during the war, and Bill rubbed some people the wrong way. That's for sure.
Yeah, like, and going back to his time as consigliere, he talks about, I think it was Little Mo Presenzano, Angelo Presenzano, who is another one of the Galante crew members, more of the street guy. Him and Consolo, this informant who almost certainly has to be Bill because it's more of like Bill's perspective. Bill says that like he gave them some kind of contract. Again, he uses the term contract. It's hard to know if he means literally like kill a guy or some kind of job, but that they refused to do it. And I think that's just so telling that it's just like they didn't respect him, they didn't listen to him, they didn't see him as like an authority, even with even knowing who obviously his father is. So he didn't kind of command respect to be able to have guys follow through on something, much less try to become the boss later on.
He was the boss's son that came in and fired you at the office.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's maybe how he was, and I think later he kind of, I don't know, because he did a lot of interviews and a lot of promotion. He does seem like he could be charismatic in a way, but it's just that natural thing of just like you said, the boss's son. You can't
Yeah, he
escape.
apparently mellowed with age. He was interviewed on Bill Maher's show,
Was he
and
really? I never knew that.
yeah,
No idea.
yeah, and gave a pretty decent interview. He was very calm.
Yeah.
So it didn't reflect how he behaved earlier in his life.
And same thing in the
He
60
seemed to be
minutes.
kind of an elder.
Yeah. Same thing in that 60 minutes interview too. Like, I think because they kind of know that they're being, I think he knew enough to like, oh, I'm being filmed. I need to kind of present myself as certain. I mean, and who knows, that could have been who he was eventually. Like he could have, like you said, mellowed with age, but certainly him very quickly becoming a captain and then becoming the consigliere and having Joe have all these plans for him definitely doesn't seem like the other, like as we talked about way in the beginning, the family didn't take too well.
Well, and Joe
Yeah,
Bonanno, he
I
was
think a
essentially
lot
an
of this
orphan.
goes back to 1931, 1930, when Joe Bonanno learned his ways from Salvatore Maranzano. And I think a case could be made that Maranzano was kind of a con man,
Mm-hmm.
and we see evidence of Joe Bonanno being kind of a con man too, uh, exaggerating his stories, making himself out to be bigger than who he was.
When you
And
look at these guys who are the sons of famous bosses, and I mean, Sal Profaci is a good example where he was pretty much born into the same situation as Bill, where his father's a longtime boss. They're close to the Bonannos. Sal Profaci gets made young, but he's always a highly respected member. He becomes a captain. He kind of fades from view during the Persico War in the early 90s, but his story is much different from Bill's. It's not like being the son of a famous boss like doomed you to failing. Some guys made it work. I know Michael DeLeonardo's said that Tommy Gambino, Carlo's son, was highly respected, despite what Gravano says about him like pinning dresses together. Michael says like Tommy Gambino was considered a man of respect, and Bill, it seems like with Bill, it's not just that he was the son. It's not. I'm sure the pressure didn't help, but for whatever reason, he had a much different life.
Mm-hmm.
He had a Rolls Royce or a Lincoln when he was 14 in Arizona. Just to give
And
you
he
an
kind of grew
idea
up
of his upbringing.
too. Like, I mean, he spent part of his childhood. We're getting into like his upbringings and stuff, but still, I mean, he spent a lot of his early childhood on his own in Arizona. Obviously, looked after by people, but still, who knows? It's just it's probably wasn't an easy life. But speaking of Carmine, or going back to Carmine Galante, one of the things he does when he gets out of prison, because there are these rumors that like Galante is going to be a force to be reckoned with. I believe he was appointed acting boss for Rastelli legitimately. I have some FBI reports from the mid 70s where it says Galante is the acting boss, and this is years before he actually tries to seize full power. But one of the things he does is he reaches out to the Di Filippos, who you mentioned, Griffin, and he brings them back to New York. And Patty Di Filippo is probably one of the members made without the commission's approval, but Vito Di Filippo was a major Galante supporter, continued to support Bonanno until the bitter end, but he becomes a captain under Galante. So Galante actually pulled from the old Bonanno faction on the West Coast. The Di Filippos, I believe, were living in Las Vegas and California. Patty DiFilippo was working in a casino, but then all of a sudden they're helping direct things back in New York City, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely one of those, like, they're the only exceptions to Bonanno loyalists coming back. Like all the other ones kind of fade from view, whether they were whether they recognize themselves, or some of the older ones probably just sort of like forget it. But they're the ones who remain active, who, like you said, come back, which is very interesting because then we've talked about this, and it's more of a hypothetical, conceptual thing. But it's like, well, yeah, if Patty wasn't made with commission approval, like, was that known? it had to have been known because there's informants in the 70s who brought up that he was made during the Bonanno Wars. But it didn't seem to have been an issue. They just were like, well, okay, you're back. Galante recognizes you. That seems to have been good enough.
My grandfather did.
Yeah.
And then, if only we could have heard those phone calls between Bonanno and Galante. I mean, they would probably just be like really short coded,
Yeah.
probably nothing of interest, honestly, but just to see them would be fascinating.
There's probably no way. Yeah. I've seen a lot of references to wiretaps in the Bonanno home for a long time. And yeah, I'm sure by that point they didn't talk the way they would have talked on another wiretap. But yeah, I think I remember you bringing this up, Eric, that we've never gotten like Bonanno on a wiretap talking just as any other mafioso would. And it would be very interesting to see if something like that exists.
I agree. Yeah. And then there's a rumored meeting between Galante and Bonanno. I think there's a book that mentions that Galante took a trip to the West Coast and they believe he met with Bonanno. I don't know if it's ever been substantiated. I used to hear it a lot more. I feel like when I got into this subject, you'd see references to this Galante meeting, and then supposedly Neil Della Croce went to Arizona and met with Bonanno after Galante was killed and basically told him, this is it, you're done. Again, I don't know if that's been substantiated, but I do remember reading that many years ago. I just don't know if it actually happened and what the actual specifics were.
Yeah, definitely heard that thing too. About
it's like this seems to be when Bonanno 79 seems to mark Joe Bonanno's officially done. He writes his book, he gets into the movie business, and
yeah. And then, well, kind of in going with that, something that's came out sort of recently with these FBI files about the commission case, and one of them is this, really poor quality, but memo about an interview that Bonanno did with an FBI agent when he was in the hospital, and he talks briefly about the commission. So, even though by that point I think he'd written the book or was in the process of writing it, and his notes had come out, he did formally kind of talk about it with an FBI agent, even though
if he admitted to the existence of the mafia and the commission to an FBI agent, even if he was like, on a bunch of, medicine or something, even if he was doped up in the hospital, I mean, that's flipping. I don't care about that kind of thing, whether who's a rat, who's not, but like still, Bonanno actually talked about the inner workings with that agent. Bonanno cooperated too in his own way.
Yeah, and then his book was used for the commission case.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think that book counts as cooperating in my book.
I agree.
He may not have been an informant, but he was very informative. So, and again, we can thank that. We're grateful that we had that, because that book all of us have analyzed that book so many times. You can read it and get different perceptions from it. It's an amazing book, and I'm glad that he wrote it. It's not 100% accurate. It's not the gospel. He is deceitful. He does lie. He does, misrepresent things. But it's a very interesting document, very interesting piece of history.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think we really kind of covered it all. Like, I definitely did want to also talk about not just the war, but then the aftermath, his time in Arizona. I think with the New York stuff, it's just this kind of quick turnover of bosses, and then there's Rusty Rustilli, and I think from there the story gets really well known, as we talked about, Galante, and then Jeffrey Joe Messino. But I think the Arizona, one thing I do want to try to research more is that Arizona crew and who they were and what because I don't think they were super criminally active. Like, I think Joe says I never included them in my world, which was not true. Bill talks about it a little bit more in depth. I don't think they're super, but they're still more than a few members there. So I think that's definitely part of this story that hasn't really been brought to light yet. So that's one thing that I've been wanting to research more and get more info on.
It was much older too than they allude to, because in Bill's final book, I think it is, he identifies Peppino Venza who was a Castellammarese. He was in California and Arizona. He transferred to the San Francisco family and then moved to Italy. But Bill says he was a quote unquote group leader, the Bonanno's term for a Capodicina. So they had this early captain there, Giuseppe Venza. So they do seem to have set up a crew of some kind on the West Coast far earlier than I think people often know, you know.
According to the second book, Bound by Honor, he said there were 3 crews in Arizona.
Yeah. I remember coming across that and wondering who, like, because that just seems like there seems more than what I've been able to find. But it could be that both Bill and Charlie Battaglia were captains, and maybe there's another one, or maybe that's just one of those things where he's like, oh yeah, there were 3, and maybe it's a lie, maybe it's a boast. But still, just there's more to it than what we've kind of known. And I think the general narrative has kind of been Bonanno and all his loyalists went to Arizona, when in reality it's more like a few loyalists came with him, but there was already a crew there. So I guess that's kind of the way I was trying to present it, is like there was a crew there that, as Eric said, there was a longer history than people kind of recognize. But that's one of those little myths, I guess, that
kind of a random, from what we know, mostly through your research into who these guys were, what we know of the Arizona crew, kind of a random assortment of guys. Like there was a guy who was is it Russ Andaloro? He was a music teacher and a high school band leader who was originally from, I think, the Pittston area. And how he ended up in the Bonanno orbit, who knows? I mean, we know they would make guys like that. Like we know the traditional mafia. To us, a music teacher who's made into the mafia sounds insane. But in Sicily, we see even high-ranking guys. There was a guy who was like an agriculture instructor, things like that. So that's not that wild to me based on what we know about the Sicilian mafia. But in terms of the Bonanno family in the U.S., it's kind of a random assortment of characters. You know, a lot of them seem to be legitimate. Some of them came from not New York, but other parts of the country.
Yeah, it's definitely more of like a lot of them seem like they just kind of retired out there or had like you said, legitimate shops. But yeah, it's definitely a very interesting part of this family.
And Bill's last book he mentions the Tarantulas.
Yeah.
And
right.
I think one was very close to him later on, yeah, it probably wasn't made, we don't know for certain, but it suggested that he probably wasn't, but just very close to him.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it past the Bonannos way late in the game to be making their own guys, like having their own little ceremonies. Like I could see them doing it right up until the end, just like, yeah, I'm going to make you. And it means nothing, but still, like you could easily see them doing that. There's no evidence of it. This is just me spitballing, but still, I could easily see them still kind of thinking Sammy Gravano told that story on his podcast where he says, when he went into WITSEC in Arizona, Bonanno was really worried. He's like, who's this guy Gravano taking over? And he says, like, through a liaison, Gravano sent word back, like, you don't have to worry about me. And Bonanno was like, you're one of us now. Like something to that effect. And it's the most absurd story. Like, not looking to attack another podcast here, but still, like, Joe Bonanno in the early mid 90s is an elderly man. Gravano's a cooperating witness living in WITSEC. It's very difficult for me to believe that Bonanno sent word to a rat and was worried about Gravano taking over. I mean, like Bonanno wasn't running Arizona at the time. It's one of those little stories someone tells where you go, I'm going to need a little more than that.
I could see Joe Bonanno thinking he still runs Arizona.
Yeah, I could believe it on that level.
Well, definitely, I think, and again, one more about this, the broader story that I find so interesting, it is so much about the organization. But yeah, like even though he's essentially shelved and doesn't have any formal connections, they still see themselves as members of this organization, of this fraternity. That if a form, if because aren't like members who have flipped are still considered members, right? Like this guy coming out who was like, he could try to initiate some kind of contact along that line. But yeah, whether he actually did or not, I'm not sure. But I think that just speaks to like the Bonannos still seeing themselves as part of that network. I think is very telling and very believable. That, like you said, Eric, over until the very end, they could be making guys just for the hell of it, just to have their own fraternal network.
Yeah, because the informants say Joe Bonanno still carried himself like he was a Cosa Nostra boss. Like in his mind, he was still the boss. We know that.
Yeah, and that's very believable because in the book, like I do believe him when he says he doesn't see it as like anything criminal. He sees it as like a process, like a way of living. And I don't think that's like him sugarcoating it. I think it's what he actually believes and how he actually operated.
Oh yeah, what he said is true, but it's one side of it. You
Yeah.
know, like he left out Carmine Galante. He left
Mhm.
out these guys who were very close to him, who were killers, drug traffickers, really the most treacherous kind of criminal. What he said about like inducting guys from all walks of life and it being this Sicilian tradition, this kind of system of government, this process, that's very true too, but it included all of that and he just left out part of it.
Yeah,
Which also
definitely.
the part he left out serves him pretty well, as far as his story goes.
Mhm.
Well, it's been
Great
great
job, man.
having you on. We appreciate
Yeah.
it. And, everything you've contributed.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I mean, I'm glad I was able to come on and share this thing. Like I said, I've been researching for more than a couple of years now. So
It
it's very,
shows. Very
Yeah.
impressive.
thank you.
All right, this concludes our episode. Let's all give a thank you to Griffin for all of his hard work, research, and he's a dear friend of the show. Thank you for coming on, and we hope to have you on again.
Of course,
Thanks,
thank you
Griffin.
for having me anytime.